Alex O'Connor, who's been having a lot of really good conversations with Christians, getting the answers we want out. Of course, he had the infamous Jordan Peterson moment, getting him to answer the question of the resurrection. He's recently sat down with Destiny and tried to convince Destiny of the possibility of God existing. And now he sat down with Cliffe Knetchle. Yeah, that's his, apparently that's how you pronounce his last name, Knetchle. That's right. And they had the conversation about the G word. The G word that everyone's been saying. The G word that is uncomfortable to talk about. The G word that's being flown around all over the situation in the Middle East. And the G word, that G word apparently appearing in scripture, kings being disciplined for not pulling out the G word. And Cliff had some interesting answers. So let's jump in. Shout out to Alex O'Connor. He's on the verge of 1 million subscribers. That's incredible. He changed his name. He's no longer Cosmic Skeptic. And based
off the Destiny video, he's Cosmic Optimist.
Cosmic Optimist, that's right. And shout out to Cliff and Stuart Knetchle, who Cliff married George Janko.
Whoa! I didn't know that we were affirming.
Yeah, what? No, he did not. Yo.
He officiated their wedding, is what you meant to say.
He officiated their wedding, yes.
He didn't marry
no,
George.
But that's what we say. This pastor married them. Wow.
Let's get into this.
That was a dark joke. That was a dark joke. We're taking that out.
No, leave it, dude. I gotta advocate for myself.
No, you don't.
Yeah.
Play the video.
This grace, this omnipotence, this love and charity of the Old Testament God is expressed in the instances where he commands the complete obliteration of entire nations of people, including the women and the children, and even the animals, at multiple points throughout the history of the Israelites trying to conquer their holy land, which is promised to them by God, such that if anybody is already living there, they're driven out. And if they refuse to leave, they're chased out and they're killed. And then they come back and they kill the women and the children. Do you think that this is the same graceful, loving God that's issuing these commands?
Cosmic Skeptic's coming out.
No. Instead, I think we've got to read very carefully. First point, do I allow God to judge? In my culture, that's unacceptable. And yet the Bible insists God does have the right to judge.
I mean, there you go.
Hello.
That's a very hardcore answer. God can judge. God can wipe people out if he wants to.
Is exaggeration being used? Is hyperbole being used in a lot of those passages? Yes, it is. Because clearly, obviously, many of those people who were supposedly all wiped out appear in the next book. So you know that they weren't all wiped out. Mm-hmm. Thirdly, you look at the archaeological evidence for Jericho and Ai, and you begin to realize those were probably smaller fortresses. Yes, Rahab was in there as a... But those were not just families and women and children. Those were fortresses that were protecting the families that lived out in the countryside around them. Next point is, I think that there is not the emphasis on individualism in the Old Testament that we have in our culture.
Yep.
And yet, the more we struggle through children of alcoholics and realize that there are real consequences that stretch down through the generations. And I think the Old Testament does present a picture that we are more interconnected than we as American individualists would like to admit. And when God judges a people group, yes, some innocent people are swept along in the judgment. And that bugs me. I don't like that. And yet that is part of, I think, what the Bible is talking about when it says we're created in the image of God, meaning that we do have free will, which means there are consequences to my decisions that affect my children.
Okay, so that's a very good answer.
Yeah.
It's a answer. It's a reasonable answer. Shout out to Mitchell Best. The word used to wipe them out could be used to mean make useless or wiping out their identity as a nation or hyperbole. Inspiring Philosophy is doing a great video about this. There's multiple interpretations of this stuff.
Yeah.
There's multiple ways within these passages. We won't know any one specific view. We do know that Saul is punished for not wiping them out. Is it wiping them out in a hyperbolic sense? Is it wiping them out in a literal sense where you're literally killing animals and women and children? Like, I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know. For far too long, the bar for Christians has been set low. We've settled into a culture of sloth when it comes to spiritual matters. More Christians are skipping church, watching online, too busy for group, and not serving in their local church communities. They go about their lives not feeling connected to Jesus, and in turn, their salvation goes unnoticed by their unsaved peers. They've become indistinguishable from the world around them. We need to shift from asking, what is the bare minimum I can do for Christ, and start asking, what would it look like to live a life entirely devoted to Him? What do my friendships marriage and family relationships look like when I'm entirely devoted to Jesus? And what do my coworkers and colleagues notice about me that reflects Jesus' calling on my life? What is my relationship to my local church if I'm entirely devoted to Him? And if I were to remove those external environments and influences, in those moments of solitude, what am I craving? What consumes my mind and my desires? Who am I to my core? What does it look like to embrace my purpose, my calling, and my personal ministry in complete surrender and devotion to Christ? 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 12 describes a life that seems to have been forgotten. Live such good lives among the pagans that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day He visits us. Ephesians chapter 4, verse 11 and 12 instructs the leaders to equip God's people to do His work and build up the church, the body of Christ. So join me and my favorite pastors, podcasters, and performers March 27th through 29th at the Bless God Summit in Southern California, and discover your personal ministry, calling, and purpose when living in complete devotion to Jesus. It's time to stop blending in and start living out the life you were called to live. We'll see you there.
That affect my grandchildren. We're more interconnected than we would like to admit. So no, those children are not being punished for anything they did wrong, but yes, they're born into a cursed, messed up world, and there are consequences to that. I mean, I benefited from going to Davidson College, and a lot of people sacrificed to put Davidson together. You benefited from going to Oxford University, and there are a lot of people who have over many years given sacrificially to build that. So there are real consequences that stretch down through the generations of our decisions. And also, the Bible never says that those children and all those people go to eternity separate from God. I'm convinced that we will see those children in heaven if they were killed before an age of accountability. The justice of God will ultimately triumph.
Yeah.
But do I have problems with the text? Yes, of course I have problems with the text. I don't understand it exactly. I don't understand what God is doing exactly there, why He says that kind of thing. But I'm also convinced that hyperbole is being used. And I think that's a very important thing. For instance, when I was in high school, we used to say, we're going to kill the opposing team that we're going to play that weekend. Not meaning we're literally going to kill them. And the whole idea of, in the Hebrew herem, H-E-R-E-M, of clearing out these people from the promised land. The whole idea that God had given them over 400 years to repent, and they had chosen not to, and now God clears them out. You know, I think it's a complex issue, more complex than the person would allow it to be.
Pause it. I think that's a great explanation.
I think that's
It is possible for everybody ask, why does God not suppress evil?
Yeah.
And then it seems like He's suppressing evil. Of folks that were dabbling in child sacrifice and all this craziness. So we see God suppressing evil, and then it's possibly hyperbole. Like, why are those two possible answers not wrong? Because then you get to the question of, well, if you could go in a time machine back to when Hitler was a baby and you knew his life was going to play out, and you know what I mean? Would that be evil or not evil? Like,
first time you're going to get a Republican for late term abortion.
Oh gosh, that's dark. Yo, you are dark with the humor. So you okay, bro?
Darkness.
That is not what I was saying. But that's a real like moral conundrum dilemma. I'm not saying the scripture's endorsing that. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying if the possibility of knowing how something is going to play out, God knows how something is going to play out, and therefore He's saying we're going to all these people. That's a possibility to suppress evil. You always ask God, why does God allow evil, and then He suppresses evil. And then the flip side of that is, or it's hyperbolic language, or it's a combination of the two. These people did need to have their population suppressed, but maybe they didn't literally were wiped out. How do we know they weren't literally wiped out? Because they pop up later in the Bible.
Yeah.
They keep popping up.
Yeah.
So something happened.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Cliff, he gave a lot of really good, multiple different arguments in a pretty condensed period of time. And later in the video, he actually, or Alex pushes him even further and brings it to the Israel-Palestine stuff. So guys, stick around for that.
Just says, I just can't believe that God would do something like that.
Like, what kind of instruction had these people been given? You know, like the people of Ai, the people of Jericho, the Canaanites. I mean, did they have Jewish prophets coming to them and saying, you should repent of your ways? Or were they just sort of expected to work it out on their own?
Fascinating question. I'm not sure. I do not know. Obviously, they have consciences. We all have consciences.
Yeah.
And when you study ethics from around the world, it's amazing that it seems we're all like reading off the same sheet music.
Yeah.
And there's more and more research coming out too on just how bad these people groups really
Sure,
were.
right.
I'm seeing more of this.
Child sacrifice.
Exactly. It just gets worse every year. Like how bad is it going to get? And so, but the second one, have you wrestled with this being a really culturally conditioned question.
Oh, absolutely,
in
yeah.
viewers,
That-
'cause
that-
the Chinese don't struggle with this one.
Yeah.
You know the people that had a one-child policy up until 2015, and that would, you talk about forced baby deletions. They were literally doing forced baby deletions. Whoa. They had no problem with this.
So the Christians you're saying the Christians in those countries are like, oh yeah, we've seen firsthand how bad lands can get.
Mm-hmm.
I can totally see why God would punish a land like China at that time and wipe them out completely.
Well, not that that you went to a different space. I'm saying people who are moral relativists do barbaric things all the time.
Okay.
And Alex is borrowing from a Western biblical framework and judging God based on God's own standards.
Gotcha.
So
crazy.
Right? So if you're thinking about this from a macro world level, people have been discarding babies. That's what the Christians were going in the river and taking babies out.
Hello.
So that's not uncommon for people to be like, yeah, you got one baby, you got a second one too many. And there's a whole documentary about this called One Child Policy on Amazon Prime, where they show these doctors that would have to go into these villages when they found out that, and these women were late, and there's one scene, and we covered this, one scene with a doctor standing behind himself with all these jars of babies in them. Big, like, yeah, bro. So miss me with you're borrowing from God. Like you're borrowing a framework from God and then judging God with his own framework. So I think that's what he's saying is, like, culturally speaking, there are societies that have done dark, twisted things. And if you're a moral relativist, which I believe Alex is, then why does this shock you at all?
Yeah. Speaking of which.
But I don't wrestle with it because my job here isn't to say that this is wrong. My job is to say something like what Lincoln said of slavery. If this isn't wrong, then nothing is wrong. You know, if there is such a thing as objective morality, I find it very. I mean, look, we just condemned the Canaanites in part for, they were killing children. That's exactly what God ordered the Israelites to do when they came into their nation. And we say, okay, well, these people were sinful, idolatrous, and they should have repented. Well, the same is true of the Israelites. They were sinful. They were idolatrous. And yet they had the benefit of having the prophet of God come to them with literal stone tablets telling them what to do. And even then it took them a few tries to get right. The Canaanites didn't have that. And yet when the Israelites are sinful, they get a prophet who comes and sets them straight. When the Canaanites are sinful, they get obliterated. They get exterminated. They get chased out.
Just the same way.
But were the Israelites doing child sacrifice?
That's a good point, yeah.
Or were the other nations around them doing child sacrifice? And then when they would dabble in that stuff, God would come down hard on them as well.
Yeah. Like, yeah, it's presupposing that God is only judging these different groups based off of whether they're cheating on their spouses or like things that aren't as dark as child sacrifice, but still bad. So it's like it's not just adultery. While that's a really bad one, right? It's sacrifices to pagan gods of your own children. It's
a
another
bit
level.
different. That's a bit different.
Yeah.
The Israelites were at first the hands of the Assyrians and then the Babylonians.
True, but it's wrong for the Assyrians to do that. It was wrong for the Babylonians to do that.
Yeah, but the Old Testament insists that was part of God's judgment on the Israelites for them doing the child sacrifice, temple prostitution, idolatry.
Right.
God, so it's God's. It gets back to, does God have the right to judge? Yes, he judged the Canaanites, but then remember, a few hundred years later, he judged the Jews, first at the hands of the Assyrians and then the Babylonians.
So I wanted to talk about the hyperbole thing, right? Because maybe we're not talking about killing everybody. Maybe
we're obviously not, because they were occur in the next book.
Right.
But okay, so for example, in the destruction of Ai, 12,000 people fell that day. All the people of Ai. That's what's said in the book of Joshua. Now, maybe all the people of Ai is like an exaggeration, but 12,000 people. It's pretty specific. It'd be a weird thing to be doing as hyperbole, right? We have a number of people, 12,000 people. We know it's men, we know it's women, we know it's children are slaughtered. We know that that's not hyperbole. We know that thousands of men were killed. We know that I don't want to get this wrong. Perhaps we should look at the text. Yeah, so in Joshua chapter 8, when Israel had finished killing all of the men of Ai in the fields and in the wilderness where they had chased them, and when every one of them had been put to the sword, all of the Israelites returned to Ai and killed those who were in it. 12,000 people fell that day. 12,000 men and women fell that day, all the people of Ai. So we know that women are being killed, non-combatants are being killed. We know that there are thousands of them. We also know that there were people who had left. They'd run into the wilderness. They were out of the promised land. But the Israelites chased after them and then killed them in the wilderness. And it says all of them were put to the sword. Maybe that's an exaggeration. Maybe that some of them ran away. Maybe all of the ones that they captured were put to the sword, but some of them managed to actually run away, and those are the people who show up in the next chapter. But it's only because, for want of trying, that they managed to survive. But maybe it is just hyperbole. But we know that 12,000 people were killed. We know that the Israelites then turned around after killing the fleeing combatants, came back into the city and killed who's left. Well, who's left? The women, the children, the disabled. So even if there's some hyperbole being involved here in terms of the complete destruction, maybe it's not a genocide, but it certainly still seems to be the kind of military practice which, if done today, would see condemnation and a lot more.
But that's the issue, is like, if it were done today, all of our modern just war theory is modern. It's just that.
Yeah.
So you're looking at it from, if it were done today, missing that culture from antiquity was very different.
Yep.
And so if God is suppressing one population to protect the rest of the world around them, I don't mean to sound super pragmatic and cold and callous, but there's something to that. If we knew that the one-child policy was going to extend worldwide because of a false ideology of telling people that birth rates were going to overpopulate the earth and it's going to cause the environment to scale, and then someone decides to step in and do something about it, and assassinate that president and assassinate the people that were executing this, would that be?
Yeah,
even
if it was 12,000 people.
Yeah,
it's like, I don't think the amount of people makes the situation worse. If what's being done is just and righteous.
Yes. Yeah, and yes, thank you, Joshua. Just war theory was from St. Thomas Aquinas. I'm talking about the modern implementations of it post World War II. Right? A lot of what we're judging in terms of what's happening to Israel, which we're going to get to, is post things that were established after World War II. Because if you want to go to World War II, and they were wiping out Berlin. Right? Innocents were getting killed in World War II. Civilians were getting killed in World War II. It was not just the Nazi soldiers. It was we're just wiping out people. So
I mean, that's like the premise of the opening of Chronicles of Narnia. That the bomb sirens go off, and then they all have to like run into like a safe space, and they run away, and then they get into the wardrobe. Yeah, crazy.
Yeah, I'm talking about the Allies were doing this.
Yeah, no, I know. I'm saying, but everyone's doing it.
Yeah,
everyone's getting the smoke.
Yeah,
hard it is to restrain yourself.
Do you believe that, to be clear, do you believe that innocent children were killed by Israelites on the command of God? I think it's a historical fact.
Great question.
I believe that innocent children were killed by Israeli bombs, and they happen to be Palestinians, part of Hamas maybe, or Hezbollah. I believe that there are consequences to human decisions that stretch down through the generations and that impact a lot of innocent people. And I think we're a little naive if we think that we can go into Iraq or fight a desert storm and no innocent people are going to be killed. It's one of the tragedies of war, which is a result of the sinful human heart.
But suppose, the Israeli government said, leave alive nothing that breathes. Kill the soldiers, but then once you've done that, turn around, go back, kill the women, kill the children, kill their animals, because this land is yours. I think that people wouldn't be satisfied on falling back on the defense of, hey, this is the consequence of war. This is what happens. I think people would say, okay, but the fundamental rule of just war, which I'm told is sort of stems out of the Christian tradition, is, proportionate response. And
yes, and I agree with you. Okay, but here's another problem. God told Abraham to take Isaac up on Mount Moriah and sacrifice his son.
Hello.
Now, if someone interprets that as being God's laying down wise principles for good parenting, they're an idiot.
Sure, yeah.
That is not what Genesis chapter 2 is communicating.
Right.
God gave Abraham a very specific command, and it was not to give an example of wise parenting. It was, Abraham, who's number one in your heart? Is it going to be God or is it going to be your son? Who are you going to build your future on?
Pause it. I'm lost on how he connected this from innocent children.
He connects it right here.
He connects it right here. Okay.
Your son?
I'm not quite tracking. Go ahead.
Similarly, what Israel does there in the Old Testament is not examples of just war theory. No, it is a unique example of God using a theocracy, and we don't live in a theocracy. We don't have a theocracy in Israel now. We're definitely not a theocracy in the United States or in UK. God using a theocracy to carve out a land that he brings then Messiah into. That's a one-time deed, because you're absolutely right. It is not an example of just war. No way. I recoil at that as you do, I'm sure.
Yeah, because of course the difference in this case is that you have the orders from the top man. It's sort of, if there is some extraordinary circumstance in which this kind of otherwise morally condemnable behavior can be justified, you better have the authority to know that you're making the right decision. And in this case, the Christian will be able to say that they did have that authority. But
so that's pretty. That was pretty interesting.
What stands out to you about
comparing like, look, the Abraham passage wasn't parenting advice. So if you're going to read this and try to read the modern day context into it, I mean, like, well, we don't even hold to this as just war theory. It's like, well, that's not what the original passage was. And like to your whole point about just war theory being like relatively new, as far as being implemented, then of course back then there was no just war theory. But additionally, beyond that, that wasn't even the intended purpose of that. Like this was a one-time description, or maybe not one time, but it was a description of what was happening in this era. And the same way that the Abraham passage wasn't like a parental advice, this is not a war theory advice. So we wouldn't prescribe the same thing, and we would actually see that as evil if Netanyahu was like, no, we need to go back and destroy everything, including the cats.
Well, I mean, to be fair,
dogs.
that is a lot of the propaganda against Israel right now, is that Netanyahu is saying that. You know what I mean? Like, they're just like, yeah, we want those people taken out. And it's like, that's actually not accurate.
You know, yeah.
You know?
Oh, so that's what's being propagated, but it's not. That's not actually what's being said.
Yeah, there's a chasm of difference between what we're seeing in the Old Testament,
Yes.
of passages seemingly saying, go out and take out women and children, and what's actually happening in the conversation in Gaza and in Lebanon now.
Yeah.
That's not to say that the government is acting always justly, and it's not to say that they're not fumbling. They are. I mean, they took out their own hostages. I'm pretty sure that was unintentional, but that caused real impact, right? Hostages came out, waved white flags, trying to get the soldiers' attention, and the soldiers thought it was a false thing and ended up taking out actual hostages who escaped Hamas. Like, that happened.
That's crazy.
You know what I mean? And so, like, the Israeli soldiers do that on purpose? No, I would think not. Not to take out their own citizens. So to me, what that says is they're spooked. They probably aren't the best trained. It's a crazy environment.
Yeah, everyone.
And this is the downstream effects of war.
I can see from the atheist perspective how that still feels kind of like a crazy response, because, as Alex O'Connor said in this last clip, was that like, and if he's like, and Christians have the reason to believe that God actually did give the commands, but technically, if Netanyahu was to come out and say God told me to do this, we would be like, the atheists would be like, I don't believe you. You know what I'm saying? Or even the Christians would be like, no, he didn't. But the atheists would be like, but you believe God told them to do it back then and not now. So it's like,
Yeah.
there is kind of that funkiness when it
Well,
comes to.
I think, but this is the part where I think people miss it, is that there is a degree of progressive revelation that happens, ultimately being the fullness in Jesus, that incrementally God is revealing himself. And yes, I do believe Jesus is Yahweh, the God of the Old Testament. And I think there's different parameters about what was happening there, and then the contrast of that in the New Testament saying to love your enemies.
Yeah.
I do think that it is possible that there are certain groups that are so far gone that judgment is actually mercy.
Yeah.
Judgment is mercy on the land. Judgment is mercy on the people around them. Judgment is mercy on what's going to come later.
Yeah.
How that plays out, I'm not quite sure. I'm not sure what that means, and I'm not sure how to handle all these passages.
So what if, this is also another thought, like as we see culture today, even within the past 100 years, let's say we can go in 50 years, massively shift towards these crazy ideologies that are anti-God, right? You could also argue that the reason, I guess, from God revealing himself incrementally would be to preserve the Israelites as a culture, as to not be deceived and perverted like all the other cultures.
Yeah.
And to do that, it requires massive action, because with hands off, gloves off, culture starts to move how we see it today, where it's like within 50 years, we're a whole different culture. We went from presidents praying to, I mean, hopefully we get presidents praying again, but to craziness about our kids and sexual and all this craziness. So you could also argue that, like, to preserve the Jesus coming, to preserve the lineage and God's people, that it's almost required to have a very intense wiping out of folks to preserve that culture.
Maybe. I don't know. But this is an interesting verse. Shout out to Tyreek. He just posted this. Ezekiel 33:11 says, say to them, as I live, declares the Lord, I have no pleasure in the death of the wicked, but that the wicked turn from his way and live. Turn back from your evil ways. So that's interesting that we know God's heart is not for people to perish. And this is in Ezekiel, which is there's some foreshadowing of Jesus and a new covenant in Ezekiel. But even in that, we're seeing that God's heart is not for this.
Yeah.
You know, so it's an interesting tension to be in. And again, I don't think we have to have all the answers. I'm not trying to make that a cop out, but I don't think we have to have all the answers to all the questions. How does that work? I don't quite fully know. But I do think a lot of this is looking at God through our modern framework and then judging God based on our paradigm today.
Yeah. And being like, I need all the problems answered for me.
Mm-hmm.
I think people are too used to like, I have a question. Hey Siri, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Like, man, I wonder how many XYZs live in the world today. And we're like, hey Siri, what's the answer to that? And we get answers so fast. And the things we can't get answers to create a lot of unrest in our spirit. And it's not, you're supposed to have a level of uncertainty that we're just not used to nowadays. So we think God's bad, you know?
Yeah, I want to know what do you guys think about this conversation? I think it's an interesting conversation. I think it's a cool conversation. I like that Alex is asking the questions.
Yeah.
I don't have a problem with that. I think we should have some degree of ideas for this, but I feel like this like certainty of needing to know everything is like, I don't know how that serves any practical utility. This is what I mean. A lot of what the Christian journey is, and maybe this is my opinion, I think this is scriptural, is that there is an equipping that happens for the people of God to do the work of God on this side of eternity. And I'm not trying to oversimplify it, but as that equipping happens, beauty and goodness, charity and help is ushered into society. I don't need to have answers on this to do what I know I'm supposed to do as a Christian, right?
Yeah.
Which is like, that's the point that we're trying to do with the Bless God Summit, is we're saying, hey, we want to bring you guys in the room with my favorite preachers, podcasters, performers, to place you in an environment where you can be equipped and released to go and do the ministry that God has for us to do in the world, in the marketplace, in our homes, in our societies. So if that's the objective, I don't need to have an answer and do a debate on every peripheral thing in the scriptures.
Yeah.
As you're using modern day Christian language and paradigms to judge the God that gave you the scriptures, which you're basing your morality on, I don't need to do that. I just need to go and do the ministry that I'm called to do. I need to go and be effective, right? And so I think more of that is done in person and probably less in an academic online sense. Hey, thank you so much for checking out the video. Comment down below and let me know what you think. And be sure to check out this video that YouTube is recommending just for you. Let me know if they nailed it. All right? I'll see you over there. Peace.